If not, I will let them all get settled. So just to, kick off the next panel while everybody's getting teed up. I'm obviously, thrilled to be putting out this report card and revised blueprint. I wanted to now have a panel to come up to discuss a few different perspectives on where we are with regard to different aspects of digital identity in the US and perhaps, where we should be. Over the summer, I wrote an op-ed that appeared in The Hill, which was entitled "Doing Nothing is a Policy Choice," and not a very good one when it comes to digital identity. It was written shortly after the White House, after I mentioned the National Cybersecurity Strategy, had very robust, thoughtful language, then had the implementation plan for the strategy that skipped over identity as if it had never existed. And this was happening against the backdrop of action the previous December in Congress, when a bill that would lay the foundation for comprehensive action here, the Improving Digital Identity Act, was left on the cutting room floor in the year-end package, despite having cleared key committees in the House and Senate. So the point I made in the op-ed was that whether intentionally or through just ambivalence, decisions have been made in the legislative and executive branches to do nothing when it comes to a comprehensive initiative to address challenges around identity. And I think what's often overlooked in these debates that we have in Washington on a whole bunch of different issues about whether to pass a bill or advance a policy is that if you don't do anything, choosing to do nothing, that's an active policy choice as well. It's a decision to embrace the status quo, to do nothing as other forces are changing the environment around you. And in the digital identity world, we see a lot changing that could benefit from some attention. So this panel is going to talk a little bit about the consequences of that decision as it impacts a number of different issues here in the US. So I'd love to, starting with Eva, ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their role in the space, and then we'll start to jump into the panel.
This will be super quick. Eva Velasquez, President, CEO of the ITRC, and I think you guys already have heard what my role is. We're victim advocates and victim service provider.
My name is Reverend Ben Roberts. I am a pastor here in Washington, D.C., but my church works on restoring identity documents to individuals who are experiencing homelessness or low income. We do it weekly just over in DuPont Circle.
I'm Pamela Dingle. I work for Microsoft as Director of Identity Standards. So we work on standardization of strong authentication, token ecosystems, and various other fun topics.
I'm Carol House. I currently chair the Technology Advisory Committee for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the sister agency to the SEC, if you haven't heard the CFTC. I also had a lot of jobs in government, including the National Security Council and FinCEN, leading digital identity work.
Great, thanks. Well, Ben, I wanted to start with you because while we're talking about digital identity, you come at this from a very analog perspective. But I think it's one that's really important to this discussion because as we talk about closing the gap between physical and digital credentials, there's kind of this assumption that most people already have that physical credential. And obviously, that's not the case. I've learned a lot from you over the years in terms of the struggles people deal with. Can you just share a little bit more about the work you do with the ID ministry on this topic and some of the trends and challenges you're seeing?
Certainly. So like I said, we're based here in Washington, D.C. And I appreciate that each time we do this in person, it's raining because that helps me kind of explain the situation on the street. When we look at the policies as people are approaching, trying to get their IDs back.
Are folks able to hear Ben and back? Is the mic on?
Can you hear? Am I not doing a thing right?
Switch on the...
I am on, right?
Okay.
It's just too far down.
All right.
All right, no problem. So we work here in Washington, D.C. We're helping low-income individuals and unhoused individuals get birth certificates, IDs, social security cards, so that they can do things like get a job, get housed, or enroll their kids in school. These are the primary reasons that people come to us. But usually when we're working with somebody, if they are unhoused or low income, or they just don't have their documents for a variety of reasons, like I said, it's raining. So you're sleeping on the street, you're in and out of shelters every single day. Things are stolen frequently. Things are swept up in what they call encampment clearings by city jurisdictions. Items just get wet, fall apart. You can't present a document that's damaged to be able to get something like your ID from the DMV. And even last night, we were out actually doing the physical count of the individuals sleeping on the street in DC, and people find out what we do and then they say, can I laminate my social security card? No, you cannot. No, you cannot do anything that's going to help you kind of keep that document longer. So what we end up doing is helping people, especially pay for the credential when it's the birth certificate and the ID. Here in DC, that's a $20 non-driver's ID and a $23 birth certificate. If somebody's coming to us and they have nothing in their possessions, it's usually going to end up costing them around $68. So that's the cost for the credentials plus cost for transportation from wherever you live to come see me and then go see your doctor to get a doctor's note, which you then use to help prove yourself to the Vital Records Office, and then another trip down to the DMV, all the while you're awaiting your Social Security card to arrive in the mail. So we see that in the dollar amount, but it doesn't count for things like childcare. If you've got to take a day off from work, all of those costs are adding up for our guests. And when we, at the fastest, somebody might be able to do this in a month. And that is fast. That's really fast. 2 weeks waiting for a Social Security card, 2 weeks waiting for the ID credential to come in. But what we're seeing more and more in terms of trends, especially lately, are different state jurisdictions whose wait times for to have an online application for a birth certificate processed is jumping up over 6 months more and more frequently. New York State right now, my home state of North Carolina, are each up over 6 months at the moment, and it varies. Alabama surprised us actually last week, and they turned one around in like 10 days. We were a little bit shocked. So you can imagine if you're someone who is sleeping out, who is waiting to be able to get a job, and you're looking at a month-long process or more, it just prolongs the amount of time that you're in a holding pattern, that you're on the street. So we talked a little about the cost for an individual, the cost for the community. There were more studies done pre-COVID. The one here in DC found that for us to leave someone homeless, the cost was around $26,000 a year. Oh, excuse me, for us to house someone, the cost was around $26,000 a year. To leave someone on the street, it's closer to $42,000 a year. Other studies around the country found that it was about 20% cheaper to house somebody versus leave them on the street. But the community can't save that money until somebody has those identifying documents so that they can move in, because that's the rules. You got to prove who you are before I'm going to allow you to move in. So there's a community cost, there's an individual cost in just dollars and cents. What we see a lot, and what I really want to remind people is there is the human cost on this. There is the dignity cost for somebody being constantly told over and over, you are not who you say you are, despite being yourself all your life. So we had recently, we run into this a lot. Somebody with a one-letter difference in a document. Your birth certificate says Deborah. Your Social Security card says Debbie. And suddenly you are not either of those people. And we actually just did that one. That was a year long to get this resolved. Took a court order, which the Vital Records Office then defied. And then it took council member action from the city to get the Vital Records Office to comply, issue the amended birth certificate, and then be able to go to the DMV to get her document. She did a cartwheel when she gets, so if you can imagine an adult or any of yourselves walking outside right now and doing a cartwheel, just imagine what elation it would take for you to actually want to go outside and do that right now. Like that's the kind of emotional burden that people are carrying as they're going through this process, in addition to those financial costs. I'll hold there because I know this is a shorter panel.
Well, I had a follow-up question, which is I flagged one of the features of the original Improving Digital Identity Act was, as we're giving grant dollars to states, actually have them set aside 10% of it to help people in these situations. And a lot of it was actually inspired by work the ID ministry does. I mean, both inspired, but also I guess there's an element of frustration as well in that here in DC, which is safe to say a pretty progressive city, the answer at whether it's, the Vital Records Bureau or the DMV, if you don't have information that you need to get an ID, it's not to help you. It's why don't you go see the folks over at Foundry, see if they can help you out, which to me I find infuriating that there's not something that's there. It would seem like the question should be, hey, is there something we could do to maybe help you if you're in a tough spot? Obviously, you're just here in DC, but I'm curious, you talk to other, similar groups like yours in other states, and sort of what have you been able to ascertain in terms of the challenges with getting foundational identity documents in different jurisdictions across the country?
What we've seen in the last 6 years, especially as the Real ID standards are coming into effect in all the different states, more groups like ours are popping up. We've been doing this for over 24 years now. It just started with one individual at the church helping somebody get their credential. But if you wanted to see what it's kind of looking like on a nationwide effort, a lot of groups have popped up both because of the Real ID standards and then because of individual states if they have a voter ID law. So Vote Riders is a nationwide organization that's doing this work. And then we've been familiar with somebody because they reached out, Rick Mitchell, who does the Homeless Identity Project in Arizona. He had been doing a lot of work, and we've collaborated on what we're seeing. The challenges are the same. You can't get one document without the other, and if you're starting from zero, it can become a real challenge. The trend there lately is that secondary sources of documentation are beginning to shrink, and each state has a different list of secondary documents. Florida actually has the most expansive list, but even there, we're starting to see things like a bank statement with your name and address, or a utility bill with your name and address. Those are actually starting to come off of the secondary list of items you can use to start proving who you are. So that's going to continue to be a challenge. And I know we have to make secure systems. But we can kind of see that each time we need to tweak it and make a little more secure system, one more option for somebody who's really struggling and on their worst day of their life, they just get closed out a little bit more.
Thanks. Carol, I wanted to shift to you. So you've served in government in OMB and FinCEN, the National Security Council staff. Identity, I think, has been a constant theme in everything you've been doing. What can you share from your perspectives there?
Great question. And you're right. It's hard to work at the anti-money laundering regulator or in cyber and not have identity be a critical part of what you do. I'd say that identity is a huge vulnerability and attack surface, and it's a threat right now. Weaknesses in it are a threat to our national and economic security because of weaknesses that are being exploited. And most financial crime involves identity crime, whether it's through fraud, whether it's through account takeovers, or compromise or circumvention of verification or authorization processes. Financial crime is identity crime in almost all contexts. That includes terrorism financing. Most terrorism financing involves a compromise of identity in some way, fraudulent documents and identities that are used. It's a major issue and concern. I know that FinCEN's going to be speaking later, but in their study that they recently published, they pointed to the amount of identity-related crime that they get reported to be over $200 billion. Like that is comparable to the GDP of states like Iraq and Portugal and Greece. This is a huge problem, and that's just what's being reported. Not all financial crime has to be reported to FinCEN, and that's only for the U.S. reporting institutions. So this is costing the economy trillions. And even seeing in the pandemic, we saw testimony of hundreds of billions of dollars in fraud related to U.S. pandemic relief programs. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in the course of a year and a half, 2 years, going straight to criminals of taxpayer funds. That's a problem. It's a huge issue. Everyone here knows this. Obviously, that's the point of this conference. But basically, we're doing identity wrong in government and in the financial sector. And then, of course, like was spoken to at the National Security Council, we see identity as a major vulnerability and exploit method in most cybercrime. We saw it in SolarWinds. We see it in most ransomware incidents that could have been prevented if identity systems were stronger. So it's a major vulnerability that demands coordinated strategic action led by the White House. I totally agree with the recommendations that you listed. And I'm hopeful that some work that we started when I was at the White House, that we haven't seen the work like the executive order that's been announced twice get issued yet. You were right that I was very sad to see the National Cyber Strategy, which did emphasize identity as a priority, right? Like the White House has established it as a priority in the critical emerging technologies list. Digital identity infrastructure says it's important. We see it across the interagency, stated that it's important, yet we've seen no evidence of coordinated architecture and structure for the kinds of efforts that are needed to create the fabric for the future of a digital economy. You have to get digital identity right to get the future of money right and the future of digital economies. And then ultimately try to turn identity into not an exploit and attack vector and surface, but instead turning it into a lever to support our economic growth in the future. We can't get that right unless we get digital identity right. So I guess that's strategically some of the insights from my time across countering money and cybercrime.
Thanks. I wanted to shift to Pam to get a third perspective. So you're on the standard side of Microsoft, looking to help build standards that can help Microsoft and I guess other companies as well, given that's the way standards work, enable hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions, I guess, given all the customers you all have. So let's say billions of people around the world to more easily assert and protect their identities. One of the things we often hear from parts of industry is that, hey, we got good vendor solutions that are out here today. We can solve this. But you're obviously here today because we're talking about government and policy. So why does Microsoft care about the role of the government in identity? What do you see as being important?
Right. Well, I probably, first of all, can you hear me okay? It's funny, it feels like the mic's not working, but it really is. I think number one is I am not authoritative to speak on behalf of Microsoft as to what, the role of regulation should be. So please just keep that in mind. But from my experience with 20 plus years in the identity industry, I think there's a really good pattern that's already emerging. For me, the NIST 800-63 standard is an excellent exemplar of how government regulation and industry can work together. And the reason I say that is that government, to me, is the metronome, right? We're all trying to make music together. Government's setting the pace, right? They're choosing how we work together. There's the directionality of it matters. So as long as that's happening, as long as we as vendors are being helped to align, it means we can all sing songs that harmonize with each other. And that's ultimately the goal for all of this, right? Is for regulation to help businesses be better and more accountable without necessarily causing the discordance that can come from being limited. And the reason why I think that's important is that we have a perfect second exemplar right now in the authentication world with passwords. So somebody out there asked earlier, what happens if biometrics get breached, if we fail, if that credential no longer becomes useful? Well, everyone in this room needs to recognize that's where we are right now with passwords. Passwords are a credential that have become useless to us. They are, if it's security theater right now to think that protecting a resource of the password is valuable. And so the most important thing I think for people to take away is that the answer is not regulating an answer for anyone, partially because of the edge cases. The answer is finding out how we can be agile, how we can bring new mechanisms to bear that solve our business problems, and how we can, add rigor and thought and additional, trend analysis and AI and, whatever the cool new thing is, it has to be able to apply and it has to work faster because we cannot wait 30 years to amend the next, failure in making documents, the next failure in protecting systems.
Thanks. Shifting over to Eva. So I know we've talked about some of these themes already today. Essentially the theme of the inadequacies of our digital identity system, or just broader identity systems overall, and the way it, is adversely impacting people. Can you talk a little bit more about where you think the government could be doing more on this front to help address the pain and increase cybercrime and ID theft that we're seeing?
Well, big picture, and I touched on this a little bit, is it an acknowledgement that this is an actual crime. And I know that sounds very basic, but a lot of times these victims are not treated like they are victims of a crime, they're treated like they are complaining about an inconvenience. So some changes with the way that we prioritize resources, particularly with the OJOVC, Office of Victims of Crime. I talked a little bit before about the VOCA Act and how it has very limited uses for this crime population. But I also think as government looks at embracing digital identity and at the state level, the mobile driver's licenses, we need to look at how that will impact some of these other crime types. In particular, what's really been on my mind lately is all of the mail theft. The credentials are being stolen out of the mail with not just regularity, but it is increasing exponentially. And so we are seeing driver's license. I mean, it's more than that. It's checks, it's all these other things, but let's just use driver's licenses. They're being legitimate licenses being stolen from the mail. The victim doesn't know. There is no notification process for the victim. They don't find out until that document they were expecting and think, what about the window? Oh, we'll get this to you in 10 days to 2 months. We have a backlog. You know, there's this very large window of when you can expect that. And then people often will wait even longer. So for all of that time period, they don't know that it's gone. And we don't have any type of notification process. And let's just get some of these documents out of the mail. I mean, if we start really looking at mobile driver's licenses as in looking at it is what other problems is it solving? I think government would be, I just think that could help change some of the stalling here. Instead of, digital identity, big and scary, and we have all of these issues. Let's also look at some of these other issues that it solves. Well, it will get some of them out of circulation in the mail and therefore out of circulation in the resale market, which by the way, is not just the dark web. We're seeing more and more of them appearing on the public web. They're on YouTube. The threat actors are just making videos and selling these legitimate driver's licenses on YouTube. Let's get some of them out of circulation.
Thanks. Carol, I wanted to come back to you. So note up here that with the number of hats you've worn, one of them is the co-chair at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission of their advisory subcommittee on digital assets and blockchain technology. They put out a really big report earlier this month that had a lot to say about digital identity. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the recommendations and what you think needs to happen.
Absolutely. If you're into cryptocurrency or decentralized finance, it was a great report that our subcommittee put together and the Tech Advisory Committee adopted and sent to the commission. Basically, in the world of cryptocurrency, it is a cyber criminal's favorite way to launder. And the reason for it is because of the absence of sufficient identity systems that are either built into those systems or patched on across cryptocurrency financial institutions across the world, really. In the US, we regulate cryptocurrency financial institutions. Compliance and regulation, though, are two different things. And most of the world has not yet successfully regulated for basic provisions under anti-money laundering requirements or AML. If you've heard of, if you don't know the term AML, know your customer, KYC requirements, those are administered by FinCEN, and Jeremy talked about FATF earlier. So I was a part of helping to create the first ever international standards on crypto, including KYC requirements. Basically, it's a huge issue in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, and especially what's called decentralized finance. So the idea of moving towards a system where you no longer have centralized financial institutions. There's no longer a bank that you need anymore to send a wire transfer from my pocket to yours anywhere in the world, which sounds really attractive to people that want to provide financial services in an affordable way to people around the world, but also sounds really attractive to criminals like cyber criminals. And it's currently being exploited. So again, another vector, an attack surface that's being exploited because of absence of identity. So in this report, we made some recommendations for policymakers to look at and to survey an understanding of like what are the identity systems, processes, repositories across the relevant agencies in the US government, about the kind of information that's needed, and then applying it to this new type of finance where you aren't reliant on the same kinds of intermediaries like banks, and where there are certain intermediaries that are currently not regulated, but trying to figure out where else should identity sit inside of this ecosystem? If the future of money means that intermediaries look different, then we need to figure out how identity looks different there. But then also to weigh things like privacy with discoverability. Some of the vision of people that work in blockchain is the idea of Web3 and moving towards an entirely blockchain-based internet. If you then integrate on the same rails money activity and information activity, you have a privacy and an identity problem that can be solved. But basically, we demand a higher level of privacy in our internet and information activity than we do in our finance. That's just it's just the reality of the kind of discoverability that we expect under statutes like the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering frameworks. This means that it's a policy issue and a technology issue that needs to be solved. So there's some work that policymakers need to do to really examine and look at, okay, if the future of finance really does move towards fewer intermediaries. I'm not their market. I don't like keeping my cash underneath my mattress, but who am I to tell people not to do that? And maybe that's what the future of digital money will end up looking like, is the equivalent of keeping digital cash in your digital pocket or your digital wallet. That means a lot of really tough decisions have to be made about what information should be discoverable to whom and under what conditions. And that doesn't always mean things like consent, especially in the world of finance and law enforcement. Not all discoverability involves consent, but maybe some of it should. It really, like, you have a lot of different options, and that's some of the stuff that we examined inside of this report, and looking at the tech stack for DeFi. So basically using the OSI model, if you're familiar with that, and applying it to this new form of finance, and identifying opportunities for where you could put different types of controls like identity within that stack. We didn't give an answer to what the outcome of that should be. We really painted a roadmap and a framework that financial regulators will have to account for, because DeFi isn't going away, and it's growing in experimentation, and the US we haven't yet meaningfully taken the proper steps, either regulatorily or through R&D and standards work, to create the building blocks for responsibility.
I know the report as well, I believe, referenced the Improving Digital Identity Act as something that they advised Congress to perhaps take a little more seriously.
It did. In Web3, it's funny, years ago when I was at FinCEN, and I know Anne at Treasury saw this, we would be telling the cryptocurrency sector, they had people saying, oh, you can't regulate our disruption identity. It's impossible to know who's on the other side of the internet. And we were like, that's not in fact how the internet or these emerging technologies work. You just didn't build in identity into these ecosystems. There's many companies, including some of the, in this room, that have embraced identity now and are talking about it in Web3 and creating new solutions without understanding traditional identity issues. And so they're just importing into a system with less accountability and less recourse all the problems of traditional identity. So basically, we pointed to all the core issues, like in the Improving Digital Identity Act, and other actions that are needed to create the foundational infrastructure that will allow for stronger and more trustworthy identities into this ecosystem, so that they just don't replicate all the same problems into a new ecosystem with less recourse for victims.
Let me just a follow-up on the security side, given the time you've spent working on security policy. So talking about countries, North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, these are not generally our friends. We're seeing documented evidence that they're exploiting weaknesses in digital identity infrastructure to steal identities and data and money from Americans. This panel is entitled "The Cost of Doing Nothing." When we hear things, I mean, again, there was the excuse me, story this morning in Bloomberg. North Korea stole $1 billion in crypto last year to fund their weapons programs. A lot of it through compromised identities. This feels like the sort of thing that should be a holy crap moment in sort of the security community in this town, but doesn't seem to actually get much attention. Why do you think that is?
I think identity is tough. I'm sure everyone in this room has had that issue where people, it's a vague concept to some people. They don't understand what it means. To some people, identity means your credit score and your risk profile for due diligence and whether I want to provide you a service. For other people, it's about direct onboarding, or it's about account access. And so it's your credentials. Identity, it depends on the context of it. And so I think that there's not there's not a lot of people who understand what to actually do to really get at that underlying fabric issue. Not a lot of people can see strategically what identity is and what needs to be fixed and addressed. I think that there are people who see it, and why the White House has been driving things like, at least for federal agencies within the scope of their authorities, to improve things like use of multi-factor and other mechanisms that would have prevented a lot of major cyber attacks. But ultimately, I think that the political issues around privacy and identity and things like facial recognition that can end up being politically radioactive, even if entirely misunderstood and not introduced with the proper nuance. I think that the political reality, people not understanding exactly what to do about it, and the fact that identity isn't always seen by the national security community as their issue. They see it as a cyber issue or an IT issue, or as a local law enforcement issue, because it's affecting one victim, rather than recognizing that it's costing this nation and economy trillions.
Thanks. So let me throw this out to the whole panel. A topic that comes up a lot, and you just touched on it, is, the impact on privacy and civil liberties from some of these new technologies that we might be using here. And there's some obvious concerns here that if we aren't actually thoughtful in the way we design digital identity systems or put guardrails around them, that we could end up threatening privacy and civil liberties. We need proper architecture, policies and laws to govern them. Is there also concern that doing nothing on this front might also adversely impact people the same way on these issues?
Ooh, pick me. Can I start?
Yeah, jump everybody.
Yes, and I think we talked about this before, the cost of doing nothing will just get more of the same. So I would actually make that a little bit stronger and say we are going to continue to see exponential increases. So it's going to make it significantly worse, not just these incremental increases, because look, as a lifelong fraud practitioner, and I understand you look at fraud sometimes like squeezing the balloon. So wherever you're clamping down, it's just going to grow in another area. But the reverse is true. Wherever you're not slamming the door shut on the fraudsters, not only are the professionals that are already in that space going to continue to exploit it and grow their operations, you're going to be onboarding newcomers that are like, look at how lucrative and easy this is. So the cost of doing nothing is continuing to build that ecosystem of threat actors and making it really simple for them to keep exploiting people, the identities of people, over and over and over. And I'll just end with the stat, which I don't have memorized, I'm sorry, but our re-victimization rate, and maybe James can even look it up for me, we have been shocked to see the re-victimization rate for identity crimes just can go up like a hockey stick. There's always been a number of people that said, yes, I've been a victim more than once. That's becoming more common. It's rare for someone to say, no, this is, someone in their 40s to say, no, this is the first time this has happened to me.
Any other perspectives in terms of doing nothing and the impact on people?
I think that we've sort of seen what's happened when we do nothing, and it's not a winning strategy. The question is, what collaborative strategy do we pick? And I would definitely point back to the Better Identities list in that. It's a really good list. It's well thought out. It runs the proper lines of policy without bleeding into what would be the word? I want to say religious sentiment, but that's not quite, hopefully you know what I mean there. So yeah, the cost of doing nothing is that and again, I'm sorry to use these words, the collateral damage, we have real people getting damaged. That collateral damage will grow, and it affects companies, it affects individuals, and it takes coordination to fix.
I love that term, collateral damage. And I think, it's devastating to see the absence of a coordinated structure that we know, like a lot of your recommendations are not new. I know that the Better Identity Coalition has been recommending these for years because I've been in the room where you've been recommending them for years. And I know that these are points driven and supported by many of the people in this room. So there are people that know what needs to be done. Agencies know what needs to be done. it remains confusing to me, the absence of there being action and what looks from the outside very much like fragmentation when you see prioritization and it being listed in a strategy and then entirely missed and not even referenced in an implementation plan. And 3 years into an administration that focuses so much on things like inclusion and combating these national security threats, and yet not yet seeing anything come out to help drive and really frame together and give a strategic North Star to all agencies about what they should be doing to promote the development of stronger identity verification and credentials and credential systems. I think pointing the collateral damage and presenting that to them as like your inaction is enabling this, and putting a number on it could be very impactful. So I appreciate that point that you made.
It's a good point too, and I want to, be clear as we're being harsh in some of our grades. It's not to, be dissing like the work that's happening in a lot of agencies. In fact, there's a lot of you in this room who are, driving what I would say are heroic efforts right now
Truth.
to advance, progress on different parts of digital identity. But it's that lack of a North Star, the lack of vision, coordinated funding, I think that is, we're moving, but too slow, and without that vision of what good looks like. We are almost at lunchtime, and I don't want to keep people from lunch. I believe we've got the legendary Venable quinoa salad back for return appearance. Many of you have become fond of it over the years at this event. Last question for everybody. If you could change one thing in terms of the way that government broadly approaches an identity, be it services it provides, policies that guide different aspects of identity, what would it be?
I wasn't prepared for this, so we're going to let Carol start.
I think promoting strong identity verification, which really means for regulators demanding better online verification as they do, whether it's remote or in person. Every instance of synthetic identity fraud is a verification weakness and compromise that has occurred. So we need to demand that, and we need to promote the development and issuance of strong credentials. So e-passports and supporting mobile driver's licenses that are standards compliant. I think those are some of the most impactful measures. So demanding it from the industries that conduct very highly sensitive and therefore regulated and high value activities, and then making sure that the government is doing what it needs to issue and create those.
I have a maybe odd answer, but there are creative solutions to some of these problems. So my advice would be to find the creative people who can look at this as an adoption problem. If all we do is look at this as a miserable, nasty chore that we have to drag every agency into and force them through, then that will give us one result. But if we can find ways to actually make it easy for these agencies to adopt, easy for everyone to see, why they have to do it, and then to do it without being miserable in the process, maybe we can make some progress together.
In my world, and every time at this place, it's like, we got to make it stronger. We got to make it stronger. We got to make sure. And then I have to come back and say, please don't make it too strong. My folks are experiencing the worst day of their life. They were evicted. All their stuff's on the street. Domestic violence, divorce, breakup, child abuse, whatever it is. Those are the types of days that they're experiencing. And then being asked to, in order to kind of rebuild their life and get into safer situations, being asked to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop. So, and we need the security systems. I know this, but as we build them, I've seen advantages, because when the DMV can hang on to the photo of the person for a minute, well, just a little while, it can help them replace something without having to reproduce everything. But there's a massive gap in trust, especially for my guests who have experienced trauma, who have experienced mental illness of all manner, who already deeply distrust the government, and know that they're listening to you and in your arm and everything like that. So as we're trying to get to a place where maybe the agency can vouch for you, we got a lot of trust building to do. So as we take this it feels fast to me, which is good. But for anybody who's not kind of marinating in this day to day, when they find out that somebody is retaining their info, they're going to be extra freaked out. So we got a lot of trust building to do and helping make fewer stops and make sure that people can do this on their worst day to get the credential that they need to get into a better situation is really helpful for my guest.
Thank you.
And yeah, and in listening to those three responses, it sounds like if I could wave my magic wand, we would take within those collaborative frameworks where we're pulling together the creative people and all the people that have a dog in the fight, that we make sure that it is an absolute requirement that there is a victim advocate that is present in every single one of those conversations. So the issues that Pastor Bren has brought up and that we see every day just simply are top of mind during all of those technology discussions.
All right, thank you. Well, we're a couple minutes over, so I'm not going to take questions, but round of applause for Eva and Ben, Carol and Pam. Love that we're able to get so many different perspectives. So we're now going to break for about 40 minutes, grab lunch, and we'll come back around 1:15, actually 1:10, let's say, with Andrew Shikyar from FIDO Alliance, kicking off our afternoon program. Thank you, everybody.